So one thing we didn't talk about that I think would be neat to touch on, I think David, you might might have briefly, but how it relates to puzzles or questions about free will and agency.
I mean, Barry has a really nice spiel about this. It's going to turn out that, um, um, so the kind of account you're going to get in the Mentaculus of the fact that we take ourselves to be capable of influencing the future, but not the past, okay, is going to be, I think, very surprisingly, on the face of it, a matter of degree rather than a matter of a sharp metaphysical kind of distinction. Okay. It's going to turn out to be the case that, if you evaluate a counterfactual, like suppose my finger were here instead of here at this time, okay, on the Mentaculus, that's going to change the trajectory that the world is on from t equals minus infinity to t equals plus infinity, okay? But it's going to turn out also that there are going to be many cases in which the trajectories associated with my finger being here and my finger being here toward the future splay out from one another very dramatically. Okay. So, for example, if here is the button that launches the nuclear weapons and here is just some air, okay, the difference between my finger being here and being here at this time may have consequences toward the future that are as large as the difference between a nuclear cataclysm and the absence of one. Okay. On the other hand, you're going to be able to show that the effect of the past hypothesis constraints is going to be to suck all of these trajectories very dramatically towards one another as you go back towards the past. Okay. There are going to be very minuscule differences. Okay. All the way back to t equals minus infinity. Okay. But the way we're going to account on this kind of picture for our impression that by acting now we can influence the future but not the past is that although the counterfactual consequence of my finger being here as opposed to here are going to be different throughout all time, the differences between those consequences toward the past is going to be negligible and minuscule compared to the potential difference between those consequences toward the future. And that asymmetry is coming from the fact that we have a past hypothesis in one temporal direction and no corresponding, as it were, future hypothesis in the other temporal direction. But a really interesting upshot of this that Barry has pointed out and elaborated on, and maybe I'll just introduce it and then leave it to him, is that the fact that there is this influence toward the past makes one of the standard arguments for the incompatibility of determinism, of microdeterminism, with a robust metaphysical kind of free will, with a more than Humean kind of free will. Is the consequence argument, okay? That the consequence argument goes, look,
maybe you should leave this one to me, David.
Okay, I'll leave this one to Barry. Anyway, just to introduce Barry's thing, it completely undermines the consequence argument. Barry,
so I think so. Of course, everything David was saying about negligible really is probabilistic, and that should be kept in mind in talking about this. But remember when we were looking at my T-shirt earlier, and I showed how the macroscopic histories of the world are indeterministic. That's what's being exploited here. As David was just saying, small differences in what's going on in our brains, which corresponds to different decisions we might make for a big difference in one temporal direction fact, likely will in one temporal direction, but not in the other. Because as he's saying, the past hypothesis sucks everything back into the low entropy state of the early universe. Incidentally, a point that maybe should have been emphasized earlier. When he's saying the low entropy, it's really, really, really low. And it takes some argument to show that this low entropy then actually has this consequence that in smaller, more or less isolated systems, like our bodies and so on, it basically has the same kind of consequences. Okay. So as the consequence argument is an argument it's an old argument, but it was made very famous by Peter van Inwagen. He's wrote a few books about it, which basically says, look, you can't influence the past, right? Yeah. What can we do about the past? Can't influence the laws, right? Yeah, you can't do anything about the laws. I mean, so I would jump out my window. I can't say I'd like the laws to change so I don't smatter on the ground. It won't work. But you can influence the future. But the past and the laws, if determinism is true, entails the future. So Van Inwagen argued, and this argument goes, that you can't influence the future. But free will requires you being able to influence the future. So therefore, if determinism is true, you don't have free will. That's the way a rough sketch of this argument. I'm sure you can find people who give more sophisticated versions of it, but that's the basic idea. In the context of the Mentaculus, what you got to note is that you can influence in a kind of way the microphysical past, but you can't influence the macroscopic past because of this, what we were talking about before, that the macroscopic history of the universe pretty much will be the same no matter what decision I make. And if it were to be different in some counterfactual way, because a lot of it depends on how you're going to think about counterfactuals, it's not in a way you could know anything or care anything about. And you don't know about it, the differences it makes microscopically, but you can know, and you do care about the differences your different decisions can make probabilistically in the temporal direction away from the past hypothesis towards the future. So there is a kind of room for responding to the Van Inwagen argument. Say, look, it's right that you can't influence the macroscopic past in ways you care about, but we can give an account in which having alternative decisions involves influencing the microscopic past. Now, people who have this time flows picture are not going to like that. Well, let them deal with that. Or the past is settled view. But on this kind of general Humean framework about time and laws and probability we're talking about, you can influence the microscopic past, but we don't care about it. We never notice it. But in the Mentaculus picture, we can influence the macroscopic future away from the past hypothesis, and that we do care about. And we learned over time exactly how we can influence it, and because of the temporal asymmetry of knowledge. So we know a lot about the past, and in the past, when we've made certain decisions, we had such and such results. I know I shouldn't eat what I ate for lunch in the future anymore, but I didn't act on that. Okay, and so on. So there is, I think, and more generally, when I was reading David's Time and Chance, I was a very lucky guy to be his philosopher friend, to be reading this book, because I thought, and David can correct me here, because often I'm surprised that he actually learned a lot of philosophy when he was an undergraduate, just from taking a great books course at Columbia. But I thought, boy, am I lucky, because I'm a philosopher, and I know that this is a gold mine for philosophers in this book. There's a lot of stuff that philosophers should know about from this, and this is one of them. It has this interesting consequence for this much discussed argument about free will in the philosophical literature. And I've written a little bit about that.